Hi, continuing on our 11AX versus cellular points. I had covered some downlink points. Today I'll cover some uplink points. In fact, I think this is where I think the major difference is. My name is Srikanth. I'm with NanoCell Networks. Okay, so just like in the downlink, uplink scheduling is also done by the base station or what is called as E node B in LTE. And as usual, I'll use LTE as a reference system as 5G is getting rolled out. A lot of things are common with 5G with a lot of flexibility for 5G. Just like in downlink, base station schedules and base station puts out the schedule in a channel called PDCCH, as I mentioned in my downlink summary, and it gives approximately about 4 milliseconds time for the station to send on the corresponding uplink. Okay. FDD, TDD both are managed in a similar way, and in 5G these times are slightly flexible because we have some low latency applications as well. Okay, so the orders of, at least for sort of broadband data kind of scenario, LTE has a 4 millisecond gap between the schedule coming, regular schedule coming on every downlink subframe, which is happening every 1 millisecond, and about a 4 millisecond gap between the schedule and the potential transmission. As usual, the schedule gives not just the frequency resources but also the MCS or basically all aspects of the transmission to be done by the respective UE. Okay. As mentioned in the previous and as mentioned in the downlink case, subframes are the most important ones in LTE. Subframes are 1 millisecond. Similar kind of ideas are on 5G with some flexibility, but this is roughly true at least for some of the best effort data or broadband data scenarios. So the PDCCH on a downlink subframe about 4 milliseconds earlier told the users about which resource blocks they are assigned, what modulation and coding, etc. And along with the data, the users also send what are called as reference signals, which are used to help demodulate them. So these are demodulation reference signals. There are spaces allocated, which are configured for control channels to help kind of get feedback, to get acknowledgement, NAC signals, etc. And there is also an option for the base station to allocate some region of the subframe whereby users can send what are called as sounding reference signals, which are exclusively used for uplink measurements. Okay, so it's a complete sort of set where the users send data but also manage control, also send sounding signals for measurement. Remember, all data has to be sent only when the base station or the E node B gives clear resources to the specific user. It's very important to note that. Okay, users can only send something in a sort of non-unicast resource when they use what is called as random access channel, but these are for very limited scenarios like adjusting timing and things like that. Okay, so it's a very controlled setup, and keep in mind that the measurements allow the base station or E node B to kind of carefully choose the modulation, coding, etc. Okay, and so on. What about Wi-Fi? So in Wi-Fi, and we are talking about 11AX. So in 11AX, we have this OFDMA as well on the uplink, where you can have a trigger frame from the access point, which can schedule multiple stations. Okay. And people are comparing this with LTE, which is one of my main objectives here, to see how we can clarify the scenario. Yes, there is similarity, but let's also notice some differences. I think the major difference is that trigger frames are not a must for uplink transmissions, in the sense that stations also typically can contend for the channel. Okay. Of course, when they contend and transmit, they would be transmitting what we call as SU transmissions. So those are perfectly fine and they are part of the 11AX standards. Okay. So it's not necessary that an AP has to schedule on the uplink for users to send on the uplink. Most likely stations in their old habits of Wi-Fi will always be contending, and anyway remember legacy clients like up to 11AC will be doing only this on your network where you have 11AX AP but maybe have 11AX clients as well as 11AC, 11N, etc. clients. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. The AP is also fighting along with other stations in the BSS for potential access to the channel. The second point to also note, minor but I think quite important, is a very short time gap between the trigger frame and the reaction time for the station, orders of 16 microseconds with some scope for padding. Okay, put some plus, those are also microsecond worth. So it's a very short turnaround time. So it's very good for some very low latency cases if you can manage that, but those are very tight timelines, which means that meeting this requirement itself is probably very challenging. Remember, LTE times were the orders of 4 milliseconds, and typically for best effort kind of data, 5G also is of milliseconds, slightly lesser but milliseconds. 5G also has the provision to do low latency primarily for very special cases. Okay, so the questions surrounding Wi-Fi are from a station perspective, will it be thinking when will the AP send the trigger frame? Okay, is there any notion of how long the station should wait? So these questions are very unique to Wi-Fi. These were not there in cellular because remember in cellular LTE or 5G stations don't transmit without explicit schedule from the base stations. Okay, so this I think is a very important difference, that on the uplink multi-user transmissions in 11AX are not going to be as smooth as in an LTE or a 5G case, primarily because this whole scheduling mechanism is quite new and there is a lot of uncertainty around how the stations will behave. There is no real enforcement mechanisms. There are some mild mechanisms, I would say, which are probably not as of now being talked about very widely. So this I think is very important difference, that the downlink MU being under the control of the access point is likely to be more smooth. The uplink MU, at least for the data part, in my opinion, is going to be a little bit choppy till things settle down. Maybe in 6 GHz we'll find mechanisms to ensure that this works better. So now let's compare both. So 11AX versus LTE. Remember, I didn't take 5G because of the lots of flexibility in 5G, but it has very similar ideas for typically best effort data, broadband data kind of a framework. So no regular schedule for trigger frames, whereas in LTE, as we mentioned in the downlink, uplink also gets regular schedules. Okay. Most important, uplink MU is not the only way by which even 11AX stations have to send uplink data. There is no other option in the cellular world, which means that in cellular world, uplink MU is the only way by which data can go through on the uplink. So in 11AX, stations which have the mind of their own, want to optimize the performance from their perspective, will always look for what they should do to give them sort of a better performance. Okay, legacy stations, of course, no question of even having MU capability. Lots of channel measurement possibilities using the sounding reference signals, etc. Very little uplink specific measurements. There are some in the standard, but nobody is talking about it in any major way. So that's again something which we need to think about as to how AP will figure out what could be the best MCS on the uplink. Okay, and I think the most important thing is that this whole scheduling business, and especially on the uplink, because downlink scheduling, at least in my opinion, data and the scheduler in one place, and we've been doing something, though not using OFDMA, we've been doing some amount of scheduling on the AP. But uplink scheduling is a completely new beast for Wi-Fi. Okay, and I think the whole Wi-Fi community is probably more worried about interoperability of people responding to triggers and so on, and a variety of new features, rather than thinking about how the schedule will kind of improve performance, or how to even measure the performance keeping the scheduler in mind. Okay, This is not at all a new story for cellular. Scheduler in eNode B is one of the major aspects which determines the performance of a network. Okay, so it's a very mature area with a lot of testing. Maybe the Wi-Fi community should borrow and see what can be relevant here. But at this time, I think this is a major difference where uplink is, I think, the real challenge between what I expect to see on the multi-user front between a cellular LTE 5G versus Wi-Fi.